200 centuries ago, in a limestone cave tucked against the chill of an endless winter, a woman opened her eyes. The night's fire had shrunk to glowing embers, sending up threads of smoke that curled into the stone roof above her. She moved slowly, careful not to wake the children who slept near her side, wrapped in animal skins stiff with frost at the edges. The cave around her was dark, heavy with the damp scent of earth and ash, yet alive with the faint crackle of what little flame remained. Outside, the world waited in silence. A world of ice and stone where survival hinged upon the choices she would make today. This was not a queen in a palace, nor a figure carved in marble. She was a cave woman, living 20,000 years before your own time, and the rhythm of her single day would hold together the fragile web of her people's survival. To imagine her life, you must slow your own breathing, soften your gaze, and let the weight of the present fade. The hush of her cave becomes the hush of your own room. The sound of her fire becomes the low hum in your ears. Tonight you walk beside her, quietly, through the hours that once belonged to her. She stirred the coals with a stick of charred wood, coaxing sparks into faint flame. The air smelled of smoke and fir, tinged with the sharp trace of resin from last night's branches. Keeping the fire alive was her first duty, for flame meant warmth, light, and protection against the darkness that pressed in from every corner of the world. She bent close, her breath slow and steady, until the ember brightened and a curl of heat licked upward. Thin twigs fed the flame, then thicker wood, and gradually the fire rose again, soft light painting the cave walls with trembling orange. The others shifted in their sleep, unconsciously comforted by its glow. She checked the children first, touching each face lightly, her calloused fingers gentle against their cheeks. One child murmured in his sleep and turned closer to the warmth. Another clutched a bone charm strung on sinew, a talisman against the unknown, satisfied. She wrapped her own hide cloak tighter and sat back for a moment, letting the fire's warmth settle into her chest. Each morning was like this, a moment between the vulnerability of night and the demands of day, where her task was simply to keep the boundary between life and cold death intact. Beyond the cave mouth, dawn crept slowly. The sky outside was pale, as if washed with ash. The air carried the bite of frost that cut into lungs and made each exhale visible. She gathered a basket woven from reeds, its edges rough but sturdy, and slung it over her back. From a shelf of stone she took a flint scraper and a net of twisted fibres, the tools of her day. A companion stirred beside her, another woman of the clan, and together they prepared to step out into the brittle morning. The path down from the cave was uneven, littered with frost-hardened stones. Each step pressed into soil that had frozen overnight, releasing the scent of cold earth. Their breath rose like ghosts before them as they moved toward the edge of the forest. The men of the clan had already departed days ago on a hunt that might yield nothing. Their return was uncertain. The true meal of the day, the food that kept bellies full when the hunters failed, would come from what these women carried back in their baskets. She searched first among the low shrubs, brushing aside frost to reveal clusters of berries still clinging stubbornly to their stems. Some were shriveled, bitter with the memory of summer, but she knew which to take. A few feet away, she knelt by the roots of a hardy plant, loosening the soil with her hands until a starchy tuber came free. She wiped it against her hide skirt and set it into the basket. The dull thud of food against woven reeds a quiet comfort. Her eyes scanned the ground for mushrooms, their small caps pushing through the damp earth. She knew the difference between those that nourished and those that poisoned. Generations of women had taught these distinctions, each lesson carved into memory by necessity. She plucked a handful, inspecting their gills, and added them carefully to a separate pouch. Knowledge like this was invisible, yet it was the strongest tool. She carried a map of survival drawn in taste, smell, and intuition. The forest deepened, and she bent low to peer into a hollow where bees had once nested. A thin line of wax glistened at the edge, a sign that honey might remain. Smoke from her torch, waved gently, lulled the insects into stillness. With a practiced hand, she scraped the comb free. Golden sweetness dripping onto her fingers, she licked once, savouring the burst of energy. Before tucking the comb into a leaf wrapping, honey would soothe the throats of children, mend the fatigue of the elders, and sweeten the otherwise bitter roots that filled their days. On the return path she paused near a simple snare set the night before. The twisted fibre cord was pulled tight, and a rabbit lay still beside it. She knelt silently, whispering words that were less prayer than habit, a recognition of a life taken. The animal was small, its fur still soft, but its meat would fill a pot tonight. She freed the cord, reset the trap, and placed the rabbit gently into her basket. Survival was never certain, yet even these small victories tipped the balance toward endurance. By the time the sun had lifted higher, filtering through skeletal branches, her basket was heavy. Roots, berries, mushrooms, honey, and rabbit, each piece a fragment of the day's security. She and her companion walked back toward the cave, steps steady, breaths calm. The air smelled faintly of resin and damp moss, carrying the promise of fire waiting at home. When they entered the cave, children rushed forward, voices soft but eager. She knelt, showing them the finds, letting small hands touch the smooth root or sticky comb. She spoke in murmurs, naming each plant, guiding their eyes to colour and shape. The children listened with solemn attention, their memory already shaping into the wisdom that would one day keep their own clans alive. In this way, every return from the forest was also a lesson, every meal a classroom without walls. The fire burned brighter now, filling the cave with warmth. She set aside the rabbit for skinning, washed the roots in a shallow bowl of water, and arranged the berries onto a flat stone. Around her, the clan began to stir, fully awake, their day taking shape from the raw materials she had brought back. Her role was not dramatic. She had not faced mammoths or hurled spears into the hides of giants, but her work was steady, dependable, and it was the spine upon which her people's survival rested. The cave walls, etched faintly with earlier drawings, flickered in the firelight as if watching her. Somewhere in the dark recess, older handprints lingered, reminders of women before her who had done these same tasks, who had risen at dawn, gathered food, and taught the children. Their lives were short, fragile against the weight of time, yet each day was a stone laid in the path that led here to you, listening, across the gulf of millennia. And as she moved quietly through her tasks, as her children watched with wide eyes, her single day became more than survival. It became memory, culture, continuity. The gentle rhythm of her morning, so ordinary in its time, was nothing less than the heartbeat of humanity itself. The afternoon light reached only partway into the cave, a pale wash that softened the edges of stone and faces. After the children had eaten, she gathered them in a loose circle near the warmest patch of floor. A flat piece of slate served as her table. On it she placed 3 small piles, the safe mushrooms with tight brown caps, the lookalikes whose undersides carried a bitter scent, and a bundle of leaves that would calm a sour stomach. She did not lecture. She let their hands learn first. One child traced the gills of the first mushroom with a fingertip and sniffed, wrinkling his nose at the earthy smell. Another brought the second kind close and then pulled away when the bitterness touched her tongue. The leaves she tore and crushed between her fingers until the air carried a clean, green note. The children copied her, eyes narrowed in concentration, the way young animals watch a parent's movements before trying their own. Memory built itself this way: touch, smell, repetition. She did not say remember, she only moved slowly enough for remembering to happen. The boy toddled too close to the cooking stones and she reached without looking, anchoring him at the waist until his body felt the safe distance again. The motion was practiced and patient. He leaned into her thigh, thumb in mouth, then wandered back to sit between 2 older girls who were tearing bark into strips. Those girls glanced at her once for permission and then tested the bark over and over, discovering how it split most cleanly when pulled at a steady angle. She kept watch without hovering, trusted their curiosity but kept her body ready like a fence made of warmth. When the baby woke, a thin cry rose and fell in the cave. She shifted him onto her hip and pressed her cheek to his hair. His skin smelled of smoke and milk. Rocking on the balls of her feet, she used the free hand to stir a pot at the edge of the fire, lifting a slice of root to test with her teeth. The broth answered with a soft bubble and a ribbon of steam, carrying sweetness through the chill air. She lifted a wooden spoon to cool and touched it to the baby's lip. His mouth quieted. The quiet passed outward like a ripple. The boy near the stone settled. The girls with bark relaxed their shoulders. Even the elders in the shadows let their backs sink a little deeper against the wall. Later, with the baby drowsing against her, she took a length of sinew and a bundle of plant fibres from the basket. The fibres were pale and uneven, smelling faintly of wet grass. She rolled them along her thigh with the flat of her hands. guiding the children's eyes to the twist that formed as one strand wrapped another. The motion was small and exact. It turned softness into cord, cord into line, line into net. She made a rhythm of it: roll, twist, lift, roll, twist, lift. The sound was nearly nothing, the whisper of fibre, the hush of skin on hide. The girl pressed her own fibres to her thigh, imitating the pressure and pace. The first attempt frayed. She examined the failure in her palm as if it were a beetle, curious and unafraid. The second attempt held together. The woman nodded once, approval as quiet as a breath. A boy brought her a broken snare cord. The knot sucked tight and useless. She set the baby into a soft cradle of furs beside her knee, and took the cord between her teeth just long enough to wet it. Then she held it against the floor, thumb pinning the knot, and showed him how to ease the tightness by pushing slack back through the path it had taken. He watched, body still, the way small bodies become still when a mystery begins to open. When the knot loosened with a sudden give, his shoulders jumped. She smiled into her work, not looking up, and pressed the cord back into his hands. He tried. The knot tightened again. On the third attempt, he found the path. She watched the understanding rise in his face like a small sun. She did not separate teaching from tending. Between instructions, she checked the fire's belly, lifted a toddler away from a quarrel by the back of her fur cloak, spread a blanket over an elder's legs where the cold crept in. In her mind, the camp was a moving body and she was its slow breath, drawing in what was scattered, releasing what was tight. The cave seemed to know this rhythm. Its walls gathered the little sounds fibre whispered, cord scrape, spoon tap, and softened them until the air itself became a lullaby. A thin wind found the mouth of the cave and traced a chill along the ground. She rose to wedge a thicker hide against the opening, then knelt by an elder whose cough had returned. The woman's eyes were bright in a thin face. From a small pouch, she took a pinch of dried leaves and crumbled them into warm water, stirred, and waited until the steam carried a gentler smell. She held the bowl and met the elder's gaze. The old woman's hands trembled as she took it. They both waited while the bitterness settled on the tongue and the warmth travelled down. Medicine here was not ceremony. It was attention. It was time and watching and trying again. When the elder's breath eased, she sat back and let her own shoulders soften. The baby stirred in the cradle and she slipped a finger into his small hand until the fingers wrapped and held. The weight of the entire day pressed for a moment against her spine, and then lightened at the sight of a child trying a knot for the fourth time and finding it. The fire sighed. The smoke rose straight for a while, then leaned toward the darker passage where the cave narrowed. A little later, she drew the children closer and told a story without telling it like a story. She picked up a piece of char and traced on the flat slate the round shape of a root, the flat cap of a mushroom, the spiraled twist of cord. She tapped each drawing, eyes moving from one child to the next, and then turned the slate and drew them again smaller, and then again. They repeated the names like breathroot, cap, twist. She wiped the slate with the heel of her hand so the black softened into a cloud and began again, drawing a small rabbit and a loop beside it. Then a straight line showing how a path across soft ground becomes a map when you learn to see it. She did not say map. She put the slate down and traced lines in the ash on the floor, then invited their fingers to follow. To imagine the run of a creature under bramble and the place where a snare would greet it. Their fingers moved. Their bodies leaned together. The lesson lived in their knees and wrists and the quiet turn of the head when a sound came from the cave mouth, and then faded as only wind. The youngest girl, the one with ash on her cheeks, touched the bone charm around her neck and asked with her eyes for the tune again. The woman hummed the same simple melody, lowering her voice until it blurred into the rock. The children's mouths softened. One by one they began to hum with her, not in unison, but as if each were remembering how the tune was supposed to sit inside their own chest. She let it go on until it felt like the cave was holding the sound for them. When she stopped, the echo did not. A small accident came as all days carried a boy cut his finger on the sharp edge of a flake. He startled at the sight of red, eyes wet with the shock of it. She took his hand and put it into her own mouth to clean, then pressed a pad of chewed leaf against the cut and bound it with a strip of fibre. Her movement steady, her face untroubled. She blew once on the binding and looked into his eyes until they steadied. Pain calmed when somebody else's breath told it so. The boy sat very still afterward. staring at the neat line of the wrap, proud now of its tightness. Outside, the light slipped as the sun turned. The cold crawled forward again and the shadows lengthened into the cave. She gestured to two older children to feed the fire, and they did. Careful with the thin sticks at first, then the thicker, so the flame did not smother. She watched them add wood the way she had added patience to their morning gradually, until something small but living became strong enough to carry itself. When the pot had simmered long enough to make the roots soft and the broth deep, she fed the children second bowls, and the elders, and the women who had been mending tools near the entrance. She ate last, as she always did, but she ate a little more than she had planned when she noticed a girl passing her portion back with a shy glance. She shook her head, pushed the bowl into the girl's hands, and then added a small piece from the rabbit to her own share only when the girl began to eat without argument. Care moved in both directions when it was taught that way. The baby woke again, this time with a small sound that meant nothing more than wanting to be held. She lifted him, and he settled face down along her forearm, a warm weight that fit there as if the arm had been made for that exact purpose. She swayed from heel to toe. The movement calmed her too. Her eyes drifted past the fire, past the children, to the part of the wall where old handprints slept under soot. She did not think in words the way a later world would demand. She thought in textures and roots, in the warmth of small bodies and the feel of cord tightening, in the difference between the smell of safe and bitter. When she looked at the handprints, she felt the presence of those who had taught her by placing her hand over theirs and pressing until the shapes matched. She would do the same when these children were a little taller. The day's middle hour thinned and began to tilt toward evening. She cleaned the slate with a damp cloth, then rinsed the cloth and hung it on a peg to dry. She tucked the remaining mushrooms into a pouch lined with leaves to keep them separate from the roots. She checked the traps by memory, not with her feet but with her mind, counting what would need resetting at dusk. She ran a finger along the cord the boy had repaired and smiled at its even twist, the way it lay obediently in her hand. One of the girls held up a loop of fibre she had braided herself, proud but pretending not to be. The woman nodded, then took the loop and used it to hang a small skin of water where the littlest could reach it. Tools became habits, habits became safety. The elder whose cough had quieted dozed, mouth slightly open, breath less shallow. The woman covered her with another fur and smoothed the blanket at the edges so no draught could creep in. She listened a moment to the old woman's breathing, then to the different tempo of the children at play a game of pretend snares and pretend rabbits. Laughter kept soft by the natural hush of the cave. She let the sound fill her the way the fire's warmth did, not as excitement but as contentment. The middle of the day had been spent in teaching and tending, and the signs of both were everywhere, cords coiled neatly, small hands moving with a little more certainty. The quiet that follows after hunger is answered. When a gust of wind slipped past the hide and brought a smell of fresh snow, she looked to the cave mouth and measured the light. Nearly time to turn toward the tasks of evening, toward the work that stitched a day to the next. She gathered the children with her eyes more than her voice. They came, drawn by the shift in her attention. She wiped a smudge from a cheek with her thumb. She straightened a fur at shoulder. She said nothing about obedience or rules. She only reached for a basket, and the children reached for theirs. And in that shared motion, the lesson of the day, how to keep one another alive, became something they understood without having to name. She set the slate aside and pulled a half-worked hide into the light, the skin pale where fat had been scraped away, darker at the edges where smoke had kissed it days before. A flint scraper waited on the stone beside her. She braced the hide under her knee and drew the tool toward herself with slow, even strokes. The sound was soft and steady, more like breath than work, a whisper of leather and stone. Each pass smoothed what would touch a child's shoulder, what would keep an elder's chest from the night's bite. Fat rose in tiny curls, and she gathered it with 2 fingers, setting it into a shallow bowl to be rubbed back into the hide later, to keep it supple against the hard weather as the baby slept. The older children drifted in and out of the circle, handing her a tool when she reached, learning without being told where things belonged. When the skin yielded to her palm, she wiped her hands on her skirt and took up a bone needle, its eye drilled clean by patient work weeks before. A coil of sinew rested in warm water near the fire. She lifted it, feeling it soften and stretch. Threading the needle felt like threading a day pull-through. Tighten, do not rush. She joined 2 edges, her stitches small and regular, each buried so that wind would not find a way in. A boy stood over her shoulder and watched the seam grow. his jaw loosening as he fell into the rhythm of it. She finished the run, pinched the line with thumb and forefinger, and the seam disappeared into itself as if it had always been one piece. Beside her, 2 girls worked at a net that had begun as a bundle of uneven cords by the fire last moon. The cords had improved since morning, their twist more certain now. She checked a square, tested the give, then showed how a simple knot could be tied blind by feel, thumb and first finger making a loop, the other hand bringing the tail through, the pull settling the knot where it needed to sit. The girls copied her, eyes half closed, lips moving soundlessly through the steps. The net stretched between them like a quiet promise fish from the stream when the ice let go. Birds where the grass held seeds. She did not speak of the seasons. The net said it for her. A basket waited that had begun as a ring of willow days earlier. She wet the next length of reed with her tongue and wove it. Over under, the pattern rising in a spiral. The basket took the shape of her hand because her hand returned to it. Hour after hour, day after day. She tucked a strip neatly and pressed it with the heel of her thumb so it would not spring back. A small hand reached to help. She guided it with a gentle touch at the wrist, then let it find its own pressure. When the side was tall enough to carry roots without spilling, she set the basket where the fire could dry it slowly. Not so near that it would crack, not so far that the damp would creep back in. She warmed the bowl of fat with a breath and rubbed it into the softened hide, the scent faintly sweet. The leather darkened where her hand passed, turning pliant. With the bone needle she added a thin thong at the edge to tie under a child's chin. She held the hood up, assessing it, then put it over the eldest girl's head to check the fit. The child's face opened in a grin that showed missing teeth. The hood fit snugly. The woman pulled it off again and turned it in her hands, not to admire, but to memorize the measurements for the necks. In this way, the day taught the next day, the way a stitch taught the next stitch. A pouch of red earth lay near the wall, tightly wrapped against damp. She loosened the thong and tapped a pinch into a palm, then dripped a few drops of water from her skin. The paste turned to a soft clay under her fingers. She drew 2 lines across the back of her hand to test the thickness, and beckoned the younger children. They came quietly, as if the colour asked for silence. She rubbed a thin line of ochre along a cheekbone, a curve at a wrist where a vein pulsed close to the surface, a small mark at the centre of her forehead. The marks were not for decoration alone. They were a way of saying who belonged to whom, who had been counted and seen, who carried the fire's protection through the early dark. The children's faces stilled as the cool paste touched their skin. One reached up to mirror the motion on his own cheek and left a red thumbprint there. She let it stay. From a leather bag she poured a small scatter of beads onto a fur-pierced shells pale as winter light. Tiny bone tubes. Seeds she had drilled and smoothed until they shone. The beads clicked softly together, a sound like distant rain. Her fingers sorted without looking, finding sizes by feel. She threaded them onto a strip of sinew. Shellbone shell seed. The pattern simple enough to repeat, varied enough to please the hand that made it. The girl watched the beads slide down into place, then began her own string with a concentration that made her mouth round and still. When the girl lifted the finished circle, it was not precious in the way later people would understand, but it was a proof that time could be held and counted, that a day could leave something behind you could touch. She set the beads aside and returned to the cords, testing those the children had twisted since midday. Some were strong enough now to join into longer lines. She showed how to splice 2 ends without a knot, opening each twist and laying the strands together so the seam vanished under the next turns. The longer line coiled at her feet like a sleeping snake. It would become another net, or the binding for a bundle of wood, or the tether that kept a child from straying near the cliff at dusk. Fibre, once only grass and bark and patient hands, had turned into something that could carry weight across the span of a season. The small miracle of it did not need a word. A woman from the entrance brought a cracked water skin and placed it in her lap. The seam had split where it bent too often. She warmed resin at the edge of the fire until it loosened, mixed it with a pinch of ash, and smeared a thin line along the split with a sliver of bone. The smell was sharp and clean. She pressed the edges together, breathed on them, and held them while the mixture cooled. When she let go, the seam held. The other woman's eyes softened. The skins carried the stream into the cave. Repairing them meant fewer trips into the wind. She returned the pouch of resin to its place with the carefulness you give to a thing that will be needed again. As the light thinned, she checked the snare cords once more, running them between her fingers to feel for weak places. She trimmed a frayed section with a flake and smoothed the end with a thumb wetted at her tongue, then retwisted until the cord tightened with a satisfying bite. She counted coils, not aloud but with the tiny movements of her hands, and hung them where she would reach without thinking when the last firewood had been brought in and the cave settled for the night. A few beads were left on the fur, and she threaded them onto a short strap to tie at a child's wrist. The child lifted the strap and shook it gently, listening to the soft rattling. The sound drew a smile from one of the elders, whose eyes had been far away. The woman tied the strap, then rested her hand briefly over the small wrist as if weighing the pulse's evenness. The child stilled under her palm, then resumed the gentle shaking, slower now, the way a stream slows under ice but never stops. She took up the hide again and cut 2 narrow strips from the edge, twisting them into ties. She sewed them at the throat of a cloak with 3 firm stitches and rubbed a touch of fat into the thread so it would swell and seal when the snow began. When she lifted the cloak to shake it free of scraps, the dust rose and settled back onto the floor in a fine veil. The cloak would go to a woman who had a child at her breast and a cough that had not left. Warmth given there would return as strength to carry her. Basket tomorrow. In this camp, nothing travelled only one way. The children returned the tools to their places without being told. The bone needle went into a crack in the wall where it would not be trampled. The scraper lay on the flat stone, edge turned away so no foot would find it in the dark. The net, half finished, was folded carefully over a peg so its squares would not stretch wrong in the night. She looked once around the circle, making the same inventory she made every afternoon. What had been mended, what still needed hands, what could wait until the light came again. It was not pride she felt at the sight of neat coils and straight seams. It was relief, a loosening inside the chest that meant the next hunger would be smaller, the next cold blunted. A hush settled as the cave shifted toward evening. She wiped her hands on a clean scrap of hide and drew a last thin line of ochre at the inside of her own wrist, near a small scar that had healed long ago. The mark would fade by morning, but for tonight it would remind her to count heads before sleep, to touch each brow with the back of her fingers once the fire burned low. She cleaned the slate with a damp cloth and hung the cloth near the warmth to dry. She lifted the repaired water skin and turned it, testing for leaks. None came. Outside, the light slid down the rock face like water. She listened for the short calls that meant the wood gatherers were returning, for the longer call that sometimes meant fresh tracks near the snare line. Her hands were still now, her breathing quiet. The work of the afternoon was done, not as an ending but as a threshold. What she had made would hold through the night. What she had taught would hold longer. The fireside again, settling. The smell of leather and resin, honey and ash, rested in the air like a blanket, and in that softening the camp began to turn, all together, toward the tasks of evening. Evening gathered itself at the cave mouth, thin light pouring away from the stone until only the fire made a centre for the room. She ladled the stew first for the elders, then for the children, then for the women who had worked at the entrance where the wind lived. Bowls moved hand to hand with the same care as tools. Steam rose and softened faces. She broke the rabbit into careful portions, laying a sliver of meat beside each mound of root, adding a fingertip of honey for the smallest mouths. No one spoke loudly. Hunger did not ask for words. It asked for warmth and patience, and both were here. When the bowls were empty, she wiped them with clean scraps, saving every drop. The children leaned against thighs and shoulders, heavy with food, quieter now. From a pouch near the wall, she took the bundle of red earth again, loosening the thong until powder found the palm of her hand. She wet it with a breath from the water skin and turned it with her thumb until it became paste. Neither too thick to crack, nor too thin to run. She looked toward the wall where faint handprints slept under soot and years. The stone waited. She rose, and the nearest children rose with her, not called but carried along by the tide of her intentions. At the flattest part of the wall, she pressed her palm into the ochre until the lines of her skin filled with colour. She laid her hand on the rock. Fingers spread. For a breath she held it there, letting the cool of stone meet the heat of her blood. Then she drew it away. A red shape remained. Not a drawing of a hand, but the memory of a hand. The way fire remembers wood after it is ash. She pressed a second print lower, where a child's cheek might one day rest as he learned to match his fingers to hers. She did not speak about meaning. The mark itself was the meaning here. We were Here. We are. One by one, she guided small palms into the paste and up to the wall. Some prints landed crooked. Some were only smudges where excitement outran care. She steadied wrists with the lightest touch and waited the extra heartbeat that makes a mark clear. The children watched the wall accept them and seemed to stand taller after, as if their bodies understood what their minds could not yet say, that the stone would hold them through the hours when sleep made them small, that the cave would remember even when they forgot. She set the ochre aside and reached for a charred stick, not to write words, but to pull from the fire's edge the lines that lived there, the curve of a deer's flank, the slope of a hill near the stream, the loop a snare makes when the cord is well twisted. She added a scatter of seeds at the base of tall grass, 3 strokes to show wind, a dot for the place where children must not step after dark. Near the prints she drew a cluster of short lines, the tally of today's traps checked, the quiet count that turns chance into habit. A girl leaned close, following each stroke with her breath. When the picture was finished, it was not beautiful in a way a later eye might demand, but it was true to the work of the day and to the work of tomorrow. A soft tapping began at the edge of the circle, a rhythm made with 2 sticks on a flat stone. Another joined hollow, from a small drum stretched with hide. The sound did not rise to celebration. It stayed low. The tempo of walking, of threads twisting, of a heart easing after hunger. She opened a leather wrap and took out the bone flute. It was simple, pierced with holes that had been thought through and tested until breath could find a tune. She warmed it in her hands and lifted it to her lips. The first notes came as a line more than a melody. A narrow stream of sound that slipped along the cave's curve and returned to them changed and softer. She played no song with a name. She followed the day backward embers to fire, cord to grass, mark to hand, and let the tune grow from what remained. The elder's eyes took on the shine of far places. The children stilled in the universal way children still when a story begins, even if the story is told without words. Between phrases she let the flute fall and spoke. Not loudly, never fast. She told of another winter when the ice went stubborn and the river grew thin. When they learned to split the roots thinner so the pot fed more bowls. She told of a woman whose hands had made a net tight enough to hold a skyful of small birds one spring, and how she had taught the knot to any child whose fingers were patient enough to learn. She did not say the woman's name. She pressed her palm to her own chest and then to the wall where the older prince lay. The children understood. They shifted closer, as if the air near the wall were warmer. When the flute rose again, a boy with the bandaged finger held out his wrist and shook the short string of beads she had tied there. The gentle rattle found a place in the rhythm. A girl hummed, off at first, then nearer to the pitch as her body remembered the tune from midday. She did not correct them. She lowered her own notes until the cave carried the smaller sounds, until the music belonged to the room more than to her. The fire made a sound that could be mistaken for rain. Someone yawned and tried to hide it, and several more yawned in answer, as if the cave itself were pulling a blanket over them. She laid the flute down and took up the char once more to draw a line near the prince, a line that curled into the beginning of a spiral and then stopped. Unfinished. Tomorrow would complete it, or the day after. Some things were meant to be carried across nights. The unfinished shape said this without speaking. She wiped the char on her palm and left a faint black smear beside the red. Enough. From the deeper recess she brought out a small bundle wrapped in an old hide, a necklace of shells too worn to thread again, a broken tooth strung on sinew, a tiny bundle of seeds saved from a summer that seemed like a story now. She laid the bundle near the fire and opened it so the children could see. The shells clicked like rain again. She let each child touch, one at a time, and took back each piece with the same calm that had given it. These were not treasures to be kept. Only reminders passed through the hands so fingers would remember their textures in the dark. The bundle went back into its hide and back to the shelf where smoke had darkened the stone. Voices fell into the quiet that comes after enough has been said. She moved among them with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, wiping faces, fingers, the red from palms that would go to blankets. She left the small marks on cheeks, those could fade in sleep. She checked the hide at the entrance, tucking its edge more firmly against the rock so wind would not find a way in. She added 2 thin sticks to the fire and then a thicker one, angling it so the flames would take slowly and hold through the first part of the night. Her hands were unhurried. Night should never be hurried. She sat then with her back to the wall. The baby fitted along her forearm again, his weight familiar as her own breath. The others settled. A child's head found a place on her thigh. An elder's hand found a younger hand. A foot nudged a fur closer. She looked once around, counting without numbers this face, this breath, this bundle of cords hanging ready, this pot scrubbed and turned, this print new on the wall. Everything that needed remembering had a place to rest. Before her eyes closed, she lifted her free hand and let it hover over the fire, not close enough to burn, close enough to gather what it offered: the mild sting of smoke, the thin warmth, the steadiness. She turned that hand and pressed the back of it to her own forehead, then, one by one, to the brows of the children nearest her, a touch light as ash. It was not a prayer. It was a practice. A promise as simple as the mark on the wall: we have eaten. We are warm. We will sleep. We will wake. The cave listened. The handprints looked back, unblinking and patient. The last of the light outside slid into dark and was gone. She shifted the baby once, tucking his feet under the edge of a fur, and let her head tip against stone that was cold at first and then became less so. Breath slowed around her, found the same measure, joined and layered until it sounded like a single, long exhale. In that sound lived the evening's work food shared, marks made, stories carried forward, a tune that could be found again in the morning. The fire lowered itself and held. The stone kept its memory, and in their keeping, memory kept them. Night settled fully, and the cave breathed as one body. She shifted the baby higher on her forearm and eased a fur over his legs, tucking the edge so it would not slide. Around her, shapes found their sleeping place as a child curled into the hollow behind her knees. An elder lengthened close to the wall where the stone gave back a little stored warmth. Two girls sharing a single cloak with their backs pressed together. She listened, not with worry, but with the old habit that kept small dangers small: one cough, one stir. The faint scrape of a bowl moved farther from a wandering foot. Nothing asked for her hands. The quiet asked only to be kept. She leaned toward the fire and nudged a coal deeper into the heart of the wood. The flame settled lower, a steady orange seam more than a blaze, just enough to hold through the first hours of sleep. Smoke thinned and lifted without stinging. She watched until the shape of the burning made sense to her. This stick will last. That one must be turned later, and then let her gaze soften. In that softening the cave changed, edges blurred. The red handprints on the wall seemed to draw closer, not moving, only becoming easier to see as the room forgot its angles. She counted without numbers, the way she did every night. One breath, another, another. Each attached to a face she could touch in the dark. The baby's breath quick and even. The boy with the bandaged finger deeper now, his mouth open just enough. The elder hushed still, her chest lifting with the calm of warm medicine. The two girls with a net half finished between them, the mesh folded under their heads like a pillow, their shoulders falling at the same pace. The count passed across the room and came back to her, complete. She drew her palm through the air above the fire and pressed the back of her hand to her own forehead, letting the warmth speak to her skin. Then she leaned and touched the same warmth lightly to the brow of the child behind her knees, to the soft hair of the baby, to the elder's temple, to the girls' crowns where the day's dust had settled. The gesture carried no words. It was simply the way a day answered for itself before it ended. Her shoulders lowered. The weight between them loosened. The stone at her back felt less cold, as if the wall had decided to hold a little of her for her, just until morning. Beyond the hide at the cave mouth, the wind moved along the rock face with a sound like water far away. Inside, the fire made a tiny clicking, the sound a dry branch makes when it remembers it was once alive. The smells of the room leather, ash, a thread of honey, the faint sharpness of resin thinned and layered until they became only home. She lay down then, not all at once, but in the careful way that does not disturb the arrangement of warmth that has arranged itself around you. The baby turned his face against her sleeve and sighed. The child behind her knees sighed too, as if answering. She let her belly soften and her jaw slacken, the way bodies know to do when danger has been measured and found small. Her eyes did not close immediately. They rested at half-lidded, watching light become less light. Somewhere deeper in the cave a drop of water found its rhythm. It fell, and then fell again. Not quickly. Not so far apart that you could forget the first before the second. The sound measured the room better than any voice could. It said the rock would still be rock when the fire learned to be embers. when the embers learned to be ash. It said the night would pass as all nights pass by, breathing. Her mind went back, briefly, over what the day had placed in her hands and what she had placed back down the root split clean. The cord that found its twist, the knot that finally learned to open, the red mark that would be there in the morning the way the wall was there now. She did not turn these into story. She let them sit and grow quiet, the way a pot grows quiet when the last bubbles stop speaking. What remained was simple and entire. They were fed, they were warm, they were within reach. The fire lowered itself one more degree. She reached without looking and turned the thicker stick a finger width, just enough to keep its promise. Then her arm returned to where the baby had chosen it to be. Heat gathered under the fur, around shins and shoulders, the kind of heat that does not call attention to itself. Breath across the room settled into similarity. One long fabric made of many threads. The cave gathered that sound into its hollows and offered it back a little smoother. Her eyes closed. Behind them, the red of the prints hovered like a dim star you see only when you're not looking at it directly. The star did not need a name. It only needed to remain. The drop of water in the dark kept time. The wind traced the hide once, then left. Sleep came not like a curtain, but like a tide, moving in small and certain steps, covering feet, then calves, then knees, then hips, and when it reached the chest it slowed and rested there, asking nothing more than the next exhale. If a memory rose, it was small and true, a child's hand learning the feel of safe mushroom gills, a girl's wrist finding the pressure that makes a splice hold, an elder's breath easing after the bitterness of leaf tea. The memory did not pull her back. It lay beside her and slept as well. The handprints on the wall, fresh and old, watched in their patient way. The half-drawn spiral near them waited for tomorrow. By the time the last ember chose its shape for the night, the room was entirely quiet. The quiet was not empty. It held the day inside it. It held the steps taken across frost, the basket's weight, the thin string of beads, the laugh that had startled at the sight of a neat bandage. It held the practice that would begin again with the first grey at the mouth of the cave coaxing a coal to flame, lifting a child's face to the light, choosing which path the feet should take to find what the clan needed next. She slept. Around her, they all slept. The cave kept them. The fire, small and faithful, kept its low red centre. The night moved past without hurry, and when the world outside finally began to pale, when the rock learned a lighter shade and the air thinned toward morning, the day they had finished would already be part of the day that waited another set of breaths to count, another coil to twist, another hand to lift and set against the stone, saying again without words here, "We are."